include these sponsors in your list of people to bring to the table to talk about loans or insurance or accounting, audit, etc. These guys put a lot of time into this, and as we get back to going in person and having great drinks and food, a lot of money. So do invite all of our FEI sponsors to the table when you're looking for help with stuff. I'm supposed to read this whole thing. I'll summarize it somewhat. We get 1 credit today. That's 15 minutes. We're going to ask 4 polling questions. You have to answer 3 of them right or wrong. Doesn't matter. You just need to show that you're living. So please answer those. When the speaker sees it, don't say close polling. Just you can move it out of your way or exit out or wait for it to go away. Just continue talking about your presentation, please. You'll get your notification on your CP in 7 to 10 business days. If for some reason Zoom or the internet blows up, Al Gore sneezes or something, and we can't get our 50 minutes out of the presentation, we will not be able to grant CPE. It's outside of our control. That's about it. With that, I want to kick it off to Mr. Chase Paxton, who will be the moderator tonight. Please, as you have questions or thoughts, his name, when you look at his name in Zoom, it will say moderator thereafter. And please direct your questions to him, and he will interject them either at the end or during the presentation as appropriate. It's all you, Chase.
Thanks, Eric. And thanks everyone for attending the Energy SIG tonight. Hopefully this is one of our last meetings that will need to be held virtually, and we can get back to our normal networking in the near future. I think as we were kind of sitting as an Energy SIG group and we were starting our transition back to the offices and in-person events and whatever the new normal ends up being, we thought it'd be topical to talk about energy transition. Which is happening a lot over the last decade, but really feels like it's accelerated over the last 18 months. I think you hear climate change, decarbonization, emerging green technology, EV, battery specs. It's constant discussion on CNBC, and energy transition it feels like a big pillar of the new administration in Washington. Tonight, to kind of help us cut through those discussions and cut through the politics and talk about the facts and the economics, and to be a very enjoyable speaker, I'm excited to introduce Rob West, who's CEO of Thunderset Energy, which is one of the leading energy consultants, specifically and only focused on energy technologies. Rob founded Thunderset in 2019 with the aim to bring a Wall Street researcher's economic mindset to energy technologies. Prior to Thunderset, Rob had built up the energy practice at Redburn, an independent equity research firm, where he's responsible for the energy team's strategy, commodity research, and coverage of super majors. He's also a research associate at Oxford. He's a CFA charter holder. And no kidding, he holds a first-class degree in experimental psychology from the University of Oxford. So I'm going to hand the reins of Zoom over to Rob, who has a presentation he's going to walk through. And as Eric mentioned, if you have any Q&A, just go ahead and chat those to me, or send me an email or send us a note, and I'll get those worked in at the end. And with that, Rob, it's all yours.
Sounds great. Thank you. I guess before I start boring you, can you see my screen and can you hear me? That seems like 2 out of 2. Well, I think I think it's a really good topic to be talking about. I actually have one slide that really matters. I always call the most important slide on the energy transition, and all of the rest is kind of what that slide means and implications. But I'll tell you what I think it means. I think the most important goal for the world is meeting the energy needs of the future and taking out all the CO2. And we tend to bind this up with a lot of confusing ideologies, but we can get to net zero. We can do it in a way that is not particularly costly, is not particularly challenging, and there's nothing incompatible, with this route to net zero with a, absolutely thriving oil and gas industry. It probably isn't a free pass on the industry we've had for the last century, But lower carbon, more efficient oil and gas combined with, decarbonization technologies, nature-based solutions, carbon capture and storage, or even CO2 EOR, as we were talking about in our breakout room, these are going to be technologies that get the world to net zero, and really are an enormous opportunity for our industry to be part of this important solution. So let me tell you why I think this, and the answer really comes down to numbers. I always like to say, if the answer to energy transition was, I don't know, drinking tea with the Cookie Monster, then I'd be writing research notes about drinking tea with the Cookie Monster. There's no, axe to grind in this research. It's just trying to find the lowest cost pathway of getting the world to net zero. I think research has a kind of look over here approach to it. So we've looked at over 110 different themes. And whenever I look at a theme, I'm really looking for three criteria. And that's how I'm scoring these, bars on this bar chart. One, it's got to be economical. You can't, as a company, invest in something that's going to make you uncompetitive. And it really strikes me that a lot of the rhetoric of what you see about energy transition is just kind of couched in very vague terms. No, we've got to be able to put numbers to it, figure out why it costs what it costs, figure out, what do you need to charge to make a 10% internal rate of return investing in this thing, and then compare all these different things apples to apples. So that's our, economic criterion. The second one is about technical readiness. You can go onto Twitter and see people claiming, they've developed a cold fusion reactor in their basement. I've read 1 million patents since starting Thunderset Energy. I can tell you nobody has developed a cold fusion reactor in their basement. And what we're trying to do with this patent analysis is actually figure out what are the holes in things, what doesn't work yet, so that if you're putting capital behind something, it's not going to be something that just turns out not to work. And the third component, I guess this is the point, is we've got to take CO2 out of the mix, and so that's a part of it as well. Let me recut this chart for you in a different way. This is my #1 slide in energy that kind of matters more than anything else, and it's this one. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide, bear with me. If you look at the world today, the energy system globally, it's about 70,000 terawatt hours. That's equivalent to a kitchen toaster running 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, for every man, woman, and child on the planet. And that emits 50 billion tons of CO2. By 2050, it's going to be about 120,000 terawatt hours of energy every year. And if we did nothing, that would emit 80 billion tons of CO2. And what I'm showing in this chart, is going through 110 research notes, 500 data files and models. There's opportunity out there to decarbonize the world 2.5 times over. And this is, it puts us in a luxurious position. We don't need to decarbonize it 2.5 times over. We need to decarbonize it once over. We don't just lunge at any technology that anybody can think of or dream of. No, we can probably pick and choose the lowest cost route to getting to net zero. And there's good reason we might want to do that. The good reason that I can think of is that on this route, if we just pick the left-hand side of this cost curve, i.e. all the stuff to the left of the 80 billion tons a year level on the x-axis, the average cost ends up being about $40 a ton as a CO2 abatement price. The highest cost we need to pay is about $70 a ton. And let me put these numbers in perspective. That this means that if we decarbonize the entire world at that $40 per ton level, it would end up costing about 1.5% of global GDP. It would end up costing about 3% of the average person in the world. And I am under no illusions. If I went to anybody in America and knocked on their door and said, hello, can I have 3% of your income, please, for this sort of ideological project? I'm worried I probably, that might not go so well. But there is no need to make this harder than it needs to be, or harder than it is, by willfully selecting technologies that don't cost $40 a ton, but $400 a ton, or God help us, $4,000 a ton, which you see people pushing for in a slightly confusing way. So what I want to talk to you about is the sort of Thunderset energy roadmap to net zero that picks the left-hand side of this cost curve. And what does it look like, and what does it mean for the world? So the important thing here is all these numbers need to join up. Here's our roadmap in terms of the energy system. And what you have here is energy around the world going back to 1750. Where we are today, that's 70,000 terawatt-hour energy system, and then the sort of commodity market impacts of taking the lowest cost route to net zero that I showed in my cost curve. And what you see is we basically get rid of all the coal. We still have about 85 million barrels a day of oil in this fully decarbonized energy system. We have about 375 TCF a year of gas. Gas demand actually trebles in this roadmap to net zero. Renewables end up doing about 20% of all of the energy in the world, wind and solar, 20%. And we'll talk a bit more about these numbers and why they come out the way they come out. When I talk about the Thunderset energy roadmap to net zero, I mean something important, which I just want to say here. Everything joins up in these models, right? I don't know, do you know the story of Henry Ford and the first automobile that Henry Ford built? I think the story goes like this: that the year is 1896, and a sort of maniac engineer called Henry Ford decides to build a gasoline-powered automobile in his little workshop, and he finishes this thing after months of tinkering at about 3 in the morning. And he's like, great, well, I finished it. I'm going to take it for a test drive. And he figures out it's too big to fit through the door of the garage. And so, the story goes, I don't know if it's true or not, the story goes that he takes a sledgehammer and he has to smash in the front wall of his workshop in order to get the car out and take it for a test drive. Why am I telling you this seemingly irrelevant story? Well, I think there's a danger that we do this when we model the energy transition. There's this danger that if you only ever focus on, this little thing over here, this car that you're building, you don't ever look at whether you can fit this car through a door. And let me put this into context. When I say, like, we've got a integrated model of how the world gets to net zero, our oil demand would be 140 million barrels a day if we did nothing, if we just kept going the way we're going by 2050. Through the technologies that we've looked at in our research, we think that's only going to be 85 million barrels a day of oil. In order to make that reduction from 140 to 85, we need to take electric vehicles from almost nothing to 2 billion vehicles on the road by 2050. And in order to do that, we need to be increasing our lithium mining for lithium-ion batteries from 65,000 tons a year to 2 million tons per year. And everything has to join up. And you have to be able to say, well, are there enough lithium reserves in the world to do that? And the answer is that there probably are. But you're going to have to see entire new industries around battery recycling that don't exist today. And that brings us to our next chart. So when I look at the market impacts of all of this, I think our roadmap to net zero is that we'd still have about $5 trillion a year of fossil fuels in this fully decarbonized energy mix. Gas would actually overtake oil as the most valuable market in fossil fuels. Wind and solar and other renewables would be about $2 trillion a year. And there'll be about $5 trillion a year associated with really new industries that either today are either in their infancy or don't exist yet. And I think the important point here is that it's going to be a mix. The idea that there's going to be kind of one winning energy technology as a sort of winner takes all doesn't really stack up with building a integrated functional model of the world. So what opportunities does that create? And I guess that's what we're going to come on and talk about next. In order to get there, in order to talk about it, I'd like to kind of frame the rest of the discussion in the context of this chart, which is our roadmap to net zero, and just kind of breaking it down to the different bars. And I think we're going to go through those different bars at least focus on a large number of them. You see the blue bar here are 80 billion tons of CO2 emissions. Remember, this is where we would be if we did nothing, if the world kind of kept going on its current trajectory. About 20% of all of the CO2 reduction we have comes from ramping up renewables, wind and solar. And I think sometimes I show people this chart and they say, what's wrong with you? Why have you only got wind and solar doing 20% of the energy in the world by 2050? Because we want it to be 100% of the energy in the world. And the answer is that's about where I get it. The current rate of wind and solar additions is about 160 gigawatts per year in 2019. I have that rate of capacity additions trebling to about 500 gigawatts per year. Let me translate that through into what it means. It means that for $300 billion a year of investment, we are currently adding about 170 terawatt hours per year of new wind and solar into the mix. How long is it going to take to transform a 100,000 terawatt hour energy system at a pace of 170 terawatt hours? The answer is it's going to take 500 years. And so even trebling the capacity additions for wind and solar, it's going to take, we're not going to get to 100%, right? And I think that's a really important thing, just looking at the numbers. There's a second component of all of this, which is today we're building wind and solar assets, and they're all building in on top of a baseline of no wind and solar assets. But the life of these assets is about 30 years. And so when we get to 2050, not only are we going to have to build wind and solar assets to keep growing renewables, but we're also going to have to build wind and solar assets to replace the wind and solar assets that are being retired from the ones we've been building today. There's another component, which is the decline rate. And I think a lot of people don't look at this. So this is data on 3,000 solar assets around the US. They tend to decline at around 2.5% per year. And 1,200 wind assets around the US decline at about 1.5% per year. And so the bigger the base of wind and solar assets gets, the more of a decline we have to offset every year. And that's another small slowdown on this mix. But the final one is I can't really get wind and solar past 50% of a grid. And here's why. We talk about wind and solar being 50% of the grid, and there's a temptation to think that means 50% all the time. But if you look at the data, and I have, say in the UK, I have 15 gigawatts of wind assets there. There is at any moment in time an equal chance that they're generating 15 gigawatts of power and 0 gigawatts of power and any level of power in between, right? It's completely linearly distributed. And what this means is that, if you have this breakdown of, wind and solar in the grid, there are going to be days like what I'm showing here, where, 10% of the time, 20% of the time, you're going to have way too much wind and solar in the grid, and power price is basically going to go negative. And by the way, if you're a industrial energy user and you can move your power to those times when power demand is negative, you can start printing money, absorbing this excess power. Conversely, there are going to be times when there's almost no wind and solar in the grid. And if we don't have enough gas-fired backup capacity, we're going to have terrible blackouts. And we're already seeing this in California, where by my math, about 17% of California's peak load power generation is basically shut down because we've booted it out. We've said we don't need you anymore, and we've replaced it with wind and solar. And on those very, very few moments when the wind and solar aren't there and they aren't generating and demand is high, just isn't enough backup capacity in the grid for that flexibility. And again, this is where if you have some flexible demand in your mix and you can move your demand to where the renewables are, you can start printing money, absorbing the excess renewables, and you can avoid spending excess money, buying your power at the times when it's really, really expensive. And in oil and gas, there are some good opportunities to do that. I think, for example, compressors in around pipelines actually have a good give around them, particularly for pipelines that aren't fully utilized, you can dial them up and dial them down, and you can increase your cash margins by about 10%, just absorbing excess power. And I'm really fascinated by opportunities that do that, where it basically costs you nothing as an industrial facility, and you can benefit from the ramp up of volatile power generation. There are some really good opportunities around this. Maybe we'll come on and talk about them a bit more. But for these reasons, the ones that I've talked about, that is the share of renewables that goes into this, fully decarbonized model. We do about 40% of all of the electricity from renewables in the world by 2050. About half of all of the world's energy is electricity. And so 20% of all of the energy is renewables. That's the first bar. The second bar we're going to talk about is coal to gas switching. And this one is a really simple observation. It goes back to this model. When I generate a megawatt hour of power from coal, I emit 1 ton of CO2. When I generate a megawatt hour of power from gas, I emit 0.35 tons of CO2. If I can't do 100% renewables, for the reasons we just talked about, I need some non-renewable source of energy, and I want to make it the lowest carbon option that I possibly can. And that's why, if you model it, you end up taking coal almost to zero and taking gas to what we have here, which is a trebling of demand for natural gas. People like to talk about fuels as though there's clean fuels and there's dirty fuels. On the numbers that I've seen, we've put together, it's much more of a spectrum. So here is a cross plot of the CO2 intensity of fuels on a pure BOE basis, looking around the world. I've also put cost on the y-axis here. And again, you can see why, if you have a choice between $60 coal and $3 gas, it's basically decarbonization for free. You get a lot lower carbon for a basically minimal uptick in cost. I think it's interesting to plot electricity on this chart. Electricity, on the current grid is actually a high carbon source of energy. The important thing with electricity is you can use it directly. So, when I put electricity into, say, an electric vehicle, I'm going to get 80% conversion from the electricity I put in to the motive power I get out. Whereas when I put oil into a vehicle, I only get 20% of the energy out of the fuel and convert it into motive power. And so it's not really apples to apples to look at electricity on this level. But particularly for components like heat, I think this is really important. You sometimes get people saying, this winds me up to no end. The way we're going to do decarbonization is we're going to electrify everything, then we're going to decarbonize electricity. That's just dead wrong when it comes to heat. If I was to take a natural gas powered heater in an industrial facility, or even on my hob over there in my kitchen, and I was to replace it with an electric alternative, my gas process is going to get 80% thermal efficiency, maybe more, converting the fuel in that natural gas into usable heat. But if I convert it into electricity first and then transmit the electricity, I'm maybe going to get 40% efficiency at best, out of that entire system. And it's just really not clear to me that it's true to say, that electrifying a lot of these processes decarbonizes them in any way. It varies process by process. So generally, I have a lot of natural gas in this fully decarbonized energy mix. And it's not to give a free pass to the gas industry and say, keep doing what you're doing. We've got to take out our methane leaks. We've got to make sure gas is used in the most responsible, lowest carbon way possible. But generally, by and large, we have an enormous amount of natural gas in this model. I'm now going to jump straight to the final bar on this chart, which is nature-based solution to climate change, or what I've called carbon offsets. And actually, you'll notice this is the biggest bar in the entire chart. And I want to just give some context around this. Carbon is part of a cycle. I'm going to talk in carbon terms here, not in CO2 terms, in carbon terms. All of man's fossil fuel emissions are about 11 billion tons of carbon per year that we move from reservoirs in the ground into the atmosphere. The nature-based carbon cycle is about 160 billion tons a year of carbon that is absorbed by all the world's trees, and about 100 billion tons a year of carbon that is absorbed in the oceans. So that's 260 billion tons of carbon in total. That's 27 times larger than all of the man-made CO2 fluxes associated with burning fossil fuels. The challenge with those nature-based, carbon pools, carbon sinks, is that carbon forms part of a cycle and it degrades. It's either re-respired back out, or forest products fall to the forest floor and they decompose. But if you just think about the sizes of those numbers, it really follows that small changes in the natural carbon cycle can have an enormous impact relative to the size of the man-made carbon cycle, associated with all the world's emissions. And that's where nature-based solutions comes in. There's maybe a dozen different types of nature-based solutions we've looked at. I want to talk about a couple of them. The single largest one is reforestation. Okay, so and actually I'll give you a chart on this. This is a breakdown of all of the emissions kind of caused by mankind, our 50 billion tons a year of CO2. The largest single category on this chart is deforestation. We tear down around 10 million hectares of forests every year around the world. There's between 200 and 300 tons of carbon stored in those forest ecosystems per hectare. And when you tear down a forest, well, that carbon moves back into the atmosphere, with some exceptions, which we'll talk about. It follows that if you come and you take these degraded areas and you restore those areas and plant new forests, we know the numbers around this. We know that about 65 to 90% of the trees that we plant are going to survive. We know that the average tree, it varies by species, but it's going to absorb about 1 ton of CO2 over the space of about 50 years. Maybe a little less, maybe like half a ton, but depends on the species. You can see on the top right-hand chart. That means that for the average forest, that's planted, we're going to absorb about 5 tons of CO2 per acre per year. That's the bottom left-hand chart. So if we do this across 3 billion acres around the world, which is the amount of degraded land that can be restored, that's a 15 billion ton per year sink for CO2 to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. The costs of doing this vary between $3 and $50 per ton. So last year, personally, I offset all of my own CO2 emissions 10 times over. It cost me about $5 per ton, or $1,000 in total. I just want to sort of say that again, because I think that's really important. It cost $1,000 not to offset all of my CO2, like 100% of my CO2, but to offset all of my CO2 10 times over, like 1,000% my CO2. This is not a solution that might exist in 10 years' time if we figure out how to manufacture, ultra pure lithium garnet oxides in a solid state battery. This is a solution that exists today. It's not a solution that is particularly expensive, and I want to give you some context. If I went out and I bought a Tesla, it would cost me $80,000 to take out about 7% of my CO2. If I went out and bought a ground source heat pump, it would cost me $35,000 to take out about 4% of my CO2. Why do I want to do that? Why wouldn't I spend $1,000 and take out 1,000% of my CO2? And there are lots of different nature-based solutions like this. If you look at forests, this is the 15 billion ton per year sink we've been talking about. If you look at farming carbon into soil, it turns out that the world's agricultural soils have gone from 4% carbon in pre-industrial times to 1% carbon today. And that loss of soil carbon is associated with historical events like the Dust Bowl, because when you take the carbon out of soils, the soils dry out and they become more dusty, and we know this chapter of history. There are practices like conservation agriculture that can restore carbon into soils. And this is a true number. With a $35 per ton CO2 price, the average farmer in the Midwest can make more money farming carbon than farming corn. If the right incentives exist to incentivize these nature-based carbon offsets, we can do 20 billion tons of CO2 reduction every year around the world. And having done these numbers, I think they're conservative numbers. I think we could probably beat this. There are opportunities like cross-laminated timber or biochar or offshore carbon offsets we've looked at, that kind of really snowball from this. And the other thing I wanted to say around this that really puts it in perspective is, let's say I'm the airline that decides to go and buy sustainable aviation fuel, like renewable diesel or like Fischer-Tropsch drop-in sustainable aviation fuel. There's a legal limit. I'm only allowed to blend this stuff in 50% with conventional jet fuel. And making this fuel also has a CO2 profile. So at most, switching from jet fuel to sustainable jet fuel is going to take out 40% of my CO2. So even if you think this is, the solution at $500 to $1,000 a ton, which is what carbon abatement costs via this pathway, it's not the full solution. You're going to need these nature-based carbon offsets as well. I guess the reason I labor this point, the reason I think it matters so much, personally, ideologically, for me, I don't know if you've ever seen the David Attenborough documentaries where he goes to the rainforest and he shows the bulldozer bulldozing the rainforest, and the orangutan is sort of there on the tree, and it's this really sad video footage. I think some of you will have seen, and the narrator comes and says the best way to avoid the destruction of nature is that everybody should divest from fossil fuels. And I watch that footage and I think, well, hold on a minute. It seems to me the best way to avoid, the destruction of nature is to avoid destroying nature. The best way to avoid bulldozing the orangutan's home has nothing to do with investing in fossil fuels. Look at the guy driving the bulldozer. He's the guy you've got to go and talk to. And so this is where I think, the sort of drive for nature-based solutions really comes from, is if you want to avoid the world becoming a wasteland and the sort of wanton destruction of nature, the best way to do this is pretty directly, restore these degraded forests, stop, destroying forests. And actually this buys a budget for the 85 million barrels a day of oil and 375 TCF of gas I've got in this mix. The final bar I'm going to talk about on this chart is decarbonized supply. And I guess when I talk about this, people tend to assume, we're talking about carbon capture and storage. I think there are some opportunities in carbon capture and storage, but they're not the opportunities that generally people think about. I've got numbers on this, I've got models on this, and I'm going to talk about a couple of these models here. If you look at this chart, you look at the left-hand bar, you can do carbon capture and storage for about $75 a ton. So it's at the upper end of what we need on our cost curves. And when I talk about this, when I build these models, I mean going to a facility that has a lot of CO2 in the exhaust, like an ethanol plant or a fertilizer plant or a steel mill, where you can have as much as 50% CO2 in the exhaust stream. And then you use the amine process to capture that CO2, and it costs you $50 a ton. Then you build a CO2 pipeline, and it costs you about $7 per ton per 100 kilometers. And then you build a multi-million ton per year disposal facility, to put that CO2 in the ground. And that's the best case. To make a 10% IRR investing in this, you need about $75 a ton. The thing is, that's not going to work in the majority of cases. If I'm going to a coal plant, I don't have 50% CO2 in the exhaust, I have 10%. If I'm going to a gas plant, I don't have 50% CO2 in the exhaust, I have 5%. And now, taking that CO2 out of the exhaust and purifying it, it costs me not $50 a ton, but $100 a ton. And if I'm going to come and do this at small scale, like a typical factory or a typical, facility, I'm not doing it at the scale of multi-million tons per year. I'm doing a few 100,000 tons a year or a few tens of thousand tons per year. And that means all of my CapEx costs of my pipelines or my disposal facilities get amortized over much smaller volumes. And pretty quickly, if you start looking at rolling conventional carbon capture and storage out, I end up with the costs being around $300 a ton. So you might have some conventional carbon capture and storage. We've built about 40 million tons of conventional CCS around the world today. Might get to 100 million tons by 2030. But really the bigger opportunities, it's got to be next generation carbon capture and storage. So, we had a great discussion in the breakout session before this about CO2 enhanced oil recovery. Now, when I put my $75 per ton CO2 in the ground, well, for every 350 kilograms I put in the ground, I get a barrel of oil out. And that pays for the CO2 sequestration because I have a sellable product. Or likewise, if you look at blue hydrogen, what you can do here is you can take natural gas, put it into an autothermal reformer and cleave it into hydrogen and CO2. You can do it in one giant facility that's an anchor tenant for a large CO2 pipeline, a large disposal facility. You can get that CO2 in the ground, and then you can sell the blue hydrogen as a zero carbon fuel to, industrial heating facilities. It's going to cost something like $1 to $1.4 a kilogram for that blue hydrogen, which translates into an abatement cost of $70 to $120 a ton, which again is kind of expensive, but it's not as expensive as trying to do like pure CCS at this scale. And there are opportunities like turning the CO2 into chemicals or turning the CO2 into materials. There are lots of opportunities in this sort of next generation bucket, including like next generation ways of using natural gas where it's much easier to sequester the CO2. So we could talk about some of those things further. I think the final point I want to make is actually I don't actually want to go through all of the blue bars on this chart, because when I start going into demand technologies and efficiency gain technologies, this is where it just gets so gritty. I mean, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of things, and if there's a particular thing that you're interested in that you've been looking at, I mean, this is kind of the core of our business, is helping companies, helping investors find opportunities that can, lower CO2 intensity at a profit without raising your cost, functionally, without screwing up your operations. And really, there are dozens and dozens of things in these, efficiency and demand buckets. But rather than sort of bore you to death talking about them, I'd actually like to end on a different note and say I'm actually really worried about some of the stuff that I've been seeing, running a consulting firm in and around energy transition. I'm worried that a lot of energy transition is kind of becoming a bubble. And I have a slide on this that I'm perilously failing to find. Maybe I took it out. It's gone. Well, since it's gone, I guess I'll talk about this slide. So I did some numbers last year around green hydrogen. Oh, look, 19 people have voted. Will you be attending another SIG event? 100% yes. I haven't done a good enough job of boring you all. This was some work we did around green hydrogen, and again, it's the same process. Model it. What do you have to charge to make a 10% return here? And the answer is, if I'm going to take in renewable energy and zap water into hydrogen and oxygen, and then store that hydrogen, and then re-release the hydrogen, and then convert that hydrogen back into usable energy, and make a 10% return at every step of this process, I need to be charging about 64 cents a kilowatt hour for my green hydrogen. If I was to come to your house and I was going to say, switch off your current power tariff and buy buy your electricity from my green hydrogen plant at 64 cents a kilowatt hour, your household energy bill in Texas would probably go up by about $13,000 per household per year, which to me seems like quite a high number. And I actually had a hydrogen company call us up and say, we'd like you to take this research note down from your website. And I thought, oh no, have I done the numbers wrong? And you know, I had a call, and there was literally a C-level executive from this company on this call. And I was like, well, you know, where have I gone wrong with the numbers? Do you think the electrolyzer costs are wrong? Do you think, you know, you're going to be able to, you know, somehow use this thing with a greater utilization rate than I have? I said, no, it's not about the numbers. It's just very unhelpful for our lobbying efforts. You know, we're trying to get policy support for our hydrogen. And when people see this, they're not going to want to give us the subsidies. And I said, well, you know, that might be the right answer. And he said, well, not for us, it's not. What's it going to cost, you know, to have you take this research report down? And I said to him, that's not how it works. You know, I publish numbers. Our opinion can't be bought. You can't pay somebody to express a particular opinion that either is illegal or should be illegal. But I believe there's a lot of this going on out there. I've done work for Congress. I've done work for, you know, for dozens of companies who kind of shared stories along this line. And my fear is that what we've got right now is a sort of a snake pit, or another analogy is like a sort of dead whale carcass, you know, labeled subsidies, and all the sharks are kind of coming in to feed. And you know, part of that is it creates this really strange incentive to spread misinformation. You know, he who lobbies hardest for the biggest subsidy gets the biggest subsidy. And I think as a sort of point around this, one is why I feel really passionate about like helping people get data and numbers to assess stuff, so that you know, we don't end up with this snake pit of lobbying. But two, I think a lot of what we have in new energies, here it is, here's the slide, you know, it is at risk of becoming a bubble. There is a perception that just the subsidies will be there, whatever they must be, in order to make some of these technologies work. And my personal view is that, you know, policymakers have a tough job. They have to set, you know, the laws of the land, but they don't get to set the laws of thermodynamics or the laws of economics. And there are some good examples in history of, for example, in the South Sea bubble of 1720, Parliament in the UK actually passed a law banning people from investing in things where they could reasonably have invested in the South Sea Company instead, and fomented trade between Britain and the South Sea territories. And you know, lo and behold, when the South Sea bubble burst in 1720, the South Sea Company's shares fell by 90%, because it turned out you couldn't push that you know, stone uphill. And I'm worried, you know, my job is to help people invest in new energies. I spend my life modeling some of these new energies, reading their patents. A lot of the stuff that people talk about is not going to work. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that bubble plays out, because sometimes you talk to people in this space and they put their fingers in their ears, and they, you know, at the moment we don't want to call a spade around some of these things. And I think the next couple of years are going to be really interesting in seeing what, you know, what shakes out when the dust settles. So I'll wrap up. I think, look, I don't want to end on this depressing note. I think in our lifetimes we are going to get to a net zero energy system. I think well-run oil and gas companies have an enormous part to play in this, making our product as efficient, as low carbon as it can be, and you know, helping the world to capture that carbon, offset that carbon, and as part of that, I'm certainly more worried about undersupply in the future in oil and gas than stranded assets or devastating oversupplies. Thank you very much for listening. Please challenge any number that I've given in my presentation, my talk here. And also, please know we have a free distribution list, on our website. If you'd like us to clutter up your inboxes, we try and send out an interesting data file or model or research note every day. And back to that example of the lobbying, I really just hope it can help get reasonable numbers in front of people, and avoid the world becoming a snake pit of misinformation. And so now over to Q&A, and if anybody has any burning questions, I'd be really happy to answer them.
Thanks, Rob. Once again, if there's anything you want to ask, just send that to the Q&A. A couple of things that had kind of come in, Rob, that I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on. One, I think, us being in Dallas, kind of the February weather events were a pretty significant issue, and obviously something that everybody dealt with, largely on a personal level. As we sometimes think about energy transition in Texas, I mean, there's this thought that part of that was caused by renewables, but just wanted to get your thoughts kind of on renewables versus winterization and kind of that aspect, and how secure kind of a grid is, with at growing that share so significantly as you sort of have it projected out.
My sense is that specific issue you mentioned is more interesting as a kind of social observation, which is that everybody I know who's an entrenched renewables bull is insistent that it was the fault of the natural gas industry and the fault of not winterizing the grid, and absolutely not the fault of renewables. And everybody that I know who is a entrenched oil and gas person seems to be insistent that it was completely the fault of renewables and nothing to do with natural gas, and the renewables broke first. And my sense kind of following it is that we have this polarization that's going on of us and them, and it's not our fault, it's their fault. And I just think everybody who went into that with a pre-existing view came out of it with their pre-existing view, but slightly stronger. And my own sense is that, I mean, if it's 6 o'clock in New York, what time is it on the sun? Some questions just don't have answers. And everybody could have produced more energy and did not produce enough energy, and trying to, ascribe blame to just one party, it doesn't really make sense. We need to have resilient grids. And what I think is quite clear is that, certainly from conversations I've had with policymakers, whatever the question is, the answer is more renewables. And when you point out some of these, grid stability issues I was talking about before, the answer weirdly just seems to be, okay, so we need even more renewables. And my sense is we're not going to change the minds of people who've already made up their minds. So what's solution number two? Solution number two is, this is the world we're going to be in. People are going to overbuild renewables. What do we do about it? How do we benefit from that economically? This is our job as investors and companies. And this is where I started looking at that theme of demand shifting. If I have, say, a electric arc furnace for steel recycling, if I can run this thing only on the days when renewables are in excess and not at all on the days when renewables are in deficit, I can literally double my cash margins by moving my demand to meet the grid. I can print money, running an asset like that. And so I have clients who are investing in stuff like that, where they're going to mop up the excess renewables and lower the costs of a flexible business. And we can do some of that in oil and gas. Yeah. But the second answer is, people who really need fully available electricity on demand are going to go behind the meter. And if I need to have 100% on electricity and the grid gets more volatile and more expensive, I buy a heat and power system, combined heat and power system. I generate my own power behind the meter. I end up saving 50, 60% on my total, energy costs because I'm generating electricity myself, and I have the reliability because I've got the generator on site. And if I can use the waste heat as well, my CO2 emissions probably fall by 20, 30%. And again, I think as we overbuild renewables, I mean, already in California, I've talked to people who are building these systems. I think they're going to make 20, 30% IRRs at current California grid economics. And, these things are going to run on gas. And so there's opportunities in getting the gas to those people. And I think, that's kind of what I've been looking at is I'm not sure we're going to sway the policy around just build more renewables. So how do we start preparing for that world, and how do we start reacting to it?
I guess sort of on the same vein, I had a question kind of come in on nuclear and whether it looks like your chart has some nuclear kind of being built, and it seems counter to the rate of decommissioning and sort of the lack of new build. And can we get to net zero without any new nuclear?
Well, I have US nuclear growing only very mildly. So nuclear grows at 2% CAGR on this model, and what drives it is China. I don't think people, over in the West realize how energy intensive China is, but let me make a couple of interesting points. There's no point us going from 11 billion tons a year of CO2 in the Western world to zero if China goes from 11 billion tons a year of CO2 to 22. There's no point all of our industry shutting down and it moving to China and the same industry happening there, but without environmental standards. So if you're going to believe that the world is going to get to net zero, we have to decarbonize China. And particularly, this matters in an industrial economy that is very, very large, where 65% of today's energy comes from coal. So on this roadmap of how we get China to net zero, which is kind of let down in this note, well, one, I need to increase my natural gas demand by about 10x to 300 BCF a day by 2060, which is equivalent to China's growth in gas demand, adding an entire global gas demand between now and 2060. We also need to increase nuclear by about 8 times. And so China is building nuclear reactors for about 70% lower cost than we are in the West. Over in the West, we need to spend about 15 cents a kilowatt hour for a new nuclear facility. China can do it about 6 to 8 cents a kilowatt hour. I've got all these numbers modeled out. And so I guess I should say that the two most undersupplied commodity markets on this roadmap to net zero are LNG and uranium, and that's why.
We have time for one more question, and it's around deforestation, and I guess why that doesn't, come through as such. I think economically, or at least from your modeling, it sounds like it's a really economic solution and maybe the most straightforward solution. And there's a way to offset it, but why that doesn't get more play? Are there areas outside of Brazil and the other rainforests where it could be employed? And just kind of the feel about, why isn't that just kind of being the leading charge? Is just it's not economic, or maybe it's in areas where there aren't corporations, or why it's not, if you can for $1,000 a year solve the issue, why not do it? Why isn't every company just sort of investing in that for kind of the sake of everyone?
Well, the answers range from the practical to the cynical. The practical is that the current reforestation market is somewhere between 60 and 100 million tons per year. And there is a fear of being accused of greenwashing. So one of the opportunities that I've been talking about with clients that I'm really excited by is, let's say you sell oil and gas. Let's say you make a margin selling oil and gas. The most logical place to carbon offset that oil and gas is at the point of sale. So if I'm going to sell, if I'm going to sell an LNG cargo, I can bundle in a set of carbon credits with that LNG cargo and sell a carbon neutral LNG cargo, because I've legally committed to you as the seller that, I've taken enough CO2 out of the atmosphere to guarantee you that you're buying, legally a carbon neutral product. And companies from Shell to other oil majors to oil traders have been doing this. They're seeing about 3 times higher demand for these cargoes than they expected. And you used to make one margin selling one product, and now you make 2 margins selling 2 products at the same time. What they say about it, though, is we don't want to go too fast. We don't want to, get involved in some PR scandal where we think we're growing a forest and it's always going great, and then like an elk comes and eats the forest, or the forest burns down, and then all of the carbon that we've taken up gets re-released, and it's a PR disaster. Actually, as a result of that, the companies that are doing this at scale today are kind of gold plating it. They're hiring consultants to go in and like measure every tree every year with a tape measure and hope that nobody gets bitten by a snake. And so I guess that's the first point, is the fear about doing it too quickly and how do we do it credibly. The other side of this, and this comes back to the lobbying efforts and what we were talking about earlier. I've genuinely had people write to me and say, don't you know, reforestation is terrible for the planet. It can't be done. It increases the risk of wildfires. And then you go and, who are these people? And you sort of dig into them, and like LinkedIn, job title, lobbyist for the hydrogen industry. And you're like, well, come on. And I think, going back to that subsidy wallet thing, we've created a world where if somebody comes in and is going to be below you on the cost curve, and just detract from your right to those big subsidies, you have now an economic need to go and discredit them. And I think that's where a lot of that comes from. So I guess that's the answers, ranging from the practical to the cynical, and there's lots more in between. I recently did a 2-hour teach-in on nature-based solutions for one of my clients. So I'm gonna disappoint you by not giving you all 2 hours of insight in 2 minutes. But I think it's the most exciting opportunity of anything I've looked at in 2.5 years since setting up Thunderset Energy. And I think companies that get it right are going to really drive a lot of decarbonisation in a very practical way. But I'll leave it there for now.
Well, thank you. I think that's a great way to kind of end tonight's speech. I think as Rob alluded to, he does have a daily note that's sort of free to sign up for. I know at NGP, we have this subscription. We get it every day. It's pretty intriguing reading. So I encourage you all to go out to his website and explore that a little bit. And with that, I just want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Like I said, hopefully this is our last kind of virtual one that we're going to have before traditional networking and drinks. And just want to thank Rob once again. It's been a great presentation. And I think it's really thought-provoking and really interesting for our group. And with that, everybody have a really good night.
Thanks again. Thank you for having me, and great talking with you.
Yeah. Bye.